New York found 800 buildings just like Happy Land after the fire. Then it forgot about all of them. March 26, 1990. The morning after. The fire at Happy Land is out. The 87 bodies have been removed. The investigation has begun. Julio Gonzalez has already confessed, and Mayor David Dinkins is sitting in a briefing room looking at a document that nobody outside city government has yet seen. The document contains a list. Buildings across New York City that have received closure orders, buildings that were formally told by a city inspector to stop operating, buildings that are still operating despite those orders, buildings where the specific combination of violations that allowed Happy Land to kill 87 people in 3 minutes is present right now, at this moment, night, in every borough. The list contains 173 names and addresses, 173 buildings. The mayor looks at the list and makes an announcement. The city will inspect every single one of them immediately. 200 inspectors will be deployed. This will not wait. And in the weeks that follow, those 200 inspectors begin their work. And as they work, they discover that 173 was not the full number. By the time the sweep is complete, they have visited not 173 buildings, 800. 800 buildings across New York City, operating in violation of the fire safety codes that should have made another Happy Land impossible. 800 buildings where people are gathering every weekend night in spaces with no sprinklers, no fire alarms, no adequate exits, no licenses, no oversight. 800 buildings where the only thing standing between the people inside and another Happy Land is the specific decision of a specific person on a specific night not to pour gasoline at the only entrance. The mayor makes more announcements, new enforcement protocols, sustained inspections, permanent task forces. The city will not let this happen again. And then the political pressure moves on, and the task force shrinks. And within months, most of those 800 buildings are exactly where they were before the sweep. This is not the story of the Happy Land fire. This is the story of what came after, and what that story reveals about how New York City decides which communities deserve protection, and which ones can wait. To understand why 800 buildings like Happy Land existed in New York City. In 1990, you need to understand what a closure order actually means. Not what it sounds like it means. What it actually means. Here's the simple version. A closure order is a document issued by a city inspector addressed to the owner of a property, stating that the property is in violation of specific codes and must cease operations until those violations are corrected. A closure order sounds like an action. It is a piece of paper. The piece of paper has legal weight. The owner who receives it is technically obligated to comply, but the enforcement of that obligation requires a series of subsequent steps that depend on the same city agencies, the same staffing levels, and the same prioritization decisions that produced the closure order in the first place. Step 1. The inspector files the closure order and moves on to the next building on their list. Step 2. If the owner does not comply, a follow-up inspection is supposed to occur. In a fully staffed, fully funded, properly prioritized inspection division, that follow-up happens within a defined time period. But New York City in the late 1980s did not have a fully staffed, fully funded, properly prioritized inspection division for commercial buildings in the Bronx, or in large sections of Brooklyn, or in the immigrant communities of Queens. Step 2 was often delayed, sometimes for weeks, sometimes for months. In the case of Happy Land, Step 2 never happened. November 1988. The closure order is issued. March 1990. 87 people are dead. 16 months of Step 2 not happening. And Happy Land was not the exception. The inspection records showed it was the rule. When the post-fire sweep teams arrived at 173 flagged buildings in the first days after the fire, they found that the majority of them were operating in essentially the same condition they had been in when the original closure orders were issued. The closure orders had not been followed up on. The buildings had simply continued, as they always had. Here is what the inspectors found when they visited those buildings. Not abstract violations, specific physical conditions in specific buildings in specific neighborhoods, a social club in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, second floor of a 2-story commercial building, 60 people inside on a Saturday night, single entrance and exit, no sprinklers, no fire alarm. Certificate of occupancy that had not been updated in 14 years. Closure order in the city file from 8 months earlier. The owner, when asked by the inspector about the closure order, says he has not received any follow-up communication from the city since the original order. He has not. A social hall in the Mott Haven section of the Bronx, ground floor of a former commercial building. A Dominican immigrant community using it for weekend gatherings and celebrations. Capacity of the space approximately 40 people. Number of people present when the inspector visits, 93, one exit, no sprinklers. Electrical system that the inspector later describes in his report as presenting an immediate fire hazard. A private club in Flushing, Queens, serving a Korean immigrant community. Third floor of a commercial building, accessible only by a single staircase. Alcohol being served, food being sold, music playing, approximately 60 people inside. No fire alarms, no sprinklers, one exit at the bottom of the staircase that opens inward. Inward opening exit doors, the same feature that turned Brooklyn Theater fire of 1876 into a death trap. Still present, still uncorrected, still illegal, still being used by real people in real buildings in 1990. 800 buildings, 800 sets of the specific conditions that produce mass casualties. When the one thing that cannot be controlled, an act of human violence or a grease fire or a faulty electrical connection occurs. Here is the question that the 800 buildings raise. Why did they exist? Not why did the inspection system fail to close them? That failure has a bureaucratic answer that involves staffing levels and enforcement resources and political priorities. Why did the buildings themselves exist? Why were there 800 illegal social clubs operating in New York City in 1990 in violation of every fire code on the books? Here is the simple version. New York City in 1990 had an enormous population of immigrant communities and low-income communities who needed exactly what illegal social clubs provided. A place to gather, to celebrate, to hear music in their language, to eat food that tasted like home, to maintain the social bonds and cultural practices that made life in a large and often indifferent city survivable. The licensed entertainment venues that existed in New York in 1990 were not built for these communities. They were priced for people with discretionary income. They were located in neighborhoods that were not the Bronx or Central Brooklyn or Western Queens. They were operated according to a commercial logic that did not prioritize the specific cultural needs of a Honduran Garifuna community celebrating Carnival, or a Dominican community marking a baptism, or a Korean immigrant community holding its annual New Year gathering. The illegal social clubs filled a gap, not because the communities they served were indifferent to their own safety, but because the legal alternatives were inaccessible, and because the city's approach to these communities and their gathering spaces had historically been one of tolerance, punctuated by occasional enforcement surges, rather than the consistent regulatory attention that might have pushed these spaces towards safety compliance. The buildings were not illegal because anyone preferred illegality. They were illegal because the path to legality was expensive, complicated, and often practically inaccessible for the operators who were trying to serve communities that had limited resources. A legal venue required a certificate of occupancy, a liquor license, a food service permit, compliance with fire codes that could cost tens of thousands of dollars to meet in an existing building, and the ongoing relationship with city agencies that the immigrant and low-income communities of the Bronx and Central Brooklyn were least equipped to navigate. So the social clubs operated without those permits, and the city tolerated the operations because the communities were not generating political pressure that made enforcement urgent. And then 87 people died in one of those operations, and the city discovered it had 800 more of them. The enforcement sweep that followed was genuine. Here is what actually happened in the spring of 1990 beyond the numbers. Teams of inspectors, some from the Department of Buildings and some from the Fire Department and some from the Department of Consumer Affairs, coordinating across agencies in a way that normally required months of planning, were deployed to every borough simultaneously. They were not just issuing new closure orders. In the most severe cases, they were padlocking doors, physically locking buildings that presented immediate danger to anyone inside. A padlocked door is harder to ignore than a closure order. It requires physical action to violate rather than simply continuing to operate, as if the paper did not arrive. Dozens of buildings received immediate padlocks in the weeks after Happyland. The operators of those buildings did not all comply quietly. Some challenged the padlocking in court, some removed the padlocks and continued operating, some relocated to nearby buildings. The immediate closure of a space that was serving a genuine community need did not eliminate that need. It displaced it. But the political will was present in March and April and May of 1990 in a way that it had not been present for years. The question was always whether that political will would last long enough to produce structural change, or whether it would fade when the cameras moved on. Here's the timeline that answers that question. March 1990, Happyland fire. 200 inspectors deployed, 800 buildings identified, dozens padlocked. April 1990, the task force continues. New procedures announced for tracking compliance with closure orders. City officials hold press conferences about the importance of sustained enforcement. May 1990. The task force is still operating, but at reduced capacity. Budget conversations are happening. 200 inspectors across all agencies working simultaneously on social club enforcement is not a routine operational capacity. It was assembled for a crisis. Maintaining it requires sustained budget allocation that was not part of the city's pre-fire planning. June 1990. The crack epidemic is at its peak. The murder rate in New York City is climbing toward the 2,245 homicides that will be recorded by year-end. Every city agency is under pressure. The Social Club Enforcement Task Force is not the highest priority in a city experiencing multiple simultaneous crises. By the end of 1990, the Enforcement Task Force has shrunk back to near its pre-fire size. The buildings that were padlocked remain padlocked. The buildings that were identified but not padlocked during the spring sweep are receiving less frequent follow-up. Some of them are still operating. Now here is the part of this story that never makes it into the accounts of Happyland. In the years and decades after 1990, there were more fires in illegal social club type establishments in New York City. Not of the scale of Happyland, not generating 87 deaths, but fires in unlicensed gathering spaces, in buildings with inadequate exits, in spaces operating beyond their intended occupancy, with safety systems that were either absent or non-functional. Some of them resulted in deaths. Some of them resulted in investigations that found the same conditions the Happyland sweep had found in 1990. The same closure orders ignored. The same enforcement gaps. The same communities in the same neighborhoods with the same absence of political power to demand consistent protection. This is not a criticism of the specific inspectors or investigators who responded to those fires. It is a description of a systemic condition that a single enforcement surge cannot resolve. The systemic condition is this: the enforcement of building safety codes in New York City has historically been inconsistent across neighborhoods. Consistent in neighborhoods with sufficient political power and economic resources to demand it. Inconsistent in neighborhoods where the communities present limited access to the political processes that determine enforcement priorities. That inconsistency was present before Happyland. It was present after Happyland. It is present in some form today. There is a man whose story captures what this systemic condition costs at the individual level. His name does not appear in most accounts of Happyland. He is a fire safety inspector who worked in the Bronx in the late 1980s and who visited multiple social club type establishments in the 18 months before the Happyland fire. Who issued citations, who wrote closure orders, who filed reports. He did everything his job required, and the buildings he cited kept operating. Not because he failed to do his job, because the follow-up mechanisms that were supposed to support his work were not functioning at the capacity needed to close the gap between a filed closure order and an actually closed building. He retired in the mid-1990s. In an interview given years after his retirement, he described what it was like to respond to the scene at Happyland on the morning of March 25, 1990. He said he knew before he arrived what he would find. Not because he had any specific foreknowledge of Happyland, but because he had been in enough buildings in the Bronx in the preceding years to know exactly what conditions produced exactly this kind of outcome. He had written closure orders for buildings very similar to Happyland. He had watched those buildings remain open. He had filed the reports and moved to the next building because there was always a next building. He said standing at the scene on the morning of March 25th felt like being handed the bill for a meal that the whole city had been eating for years. Everybody had ordered, only the 87 inside had been charged. The question this story demands to be asked is not what happened to the 800 buildings found after Happyland. The question is, what happens to the next 800? Because here is what the evidence of the 1990 sweep and its aftermath demonstrates. The existence of buildings operating in dangerous violation of fire safety codes in low-income and immigrant communities is not an occasional oversight. It is a persistent condition that is temporarily interrupted by enforcement surges triggered by catastrophic events, and then gradually reestablishes itself as the urgency fades and resources are redirected. This cycle has repeated multiple times in New York City history. Triangle Shirtwaist in 1911 produced the Factory Investigating Commission and 56 new labor laws. Happyland in 1990 produced a 200 inspector task force and 800 identified buildings and dozens of padlocked doors. Each time, the surge was real. Each time, the systemic condition that produced the catastrophe reestablished itself in the years following the surge. Because the systemic condition is not primarily about the specific regulations on the books. The regulations have generally improved after each catastrophe. The The systemic condition is about whether the enforcement of those regulations is applied consistently across all communities regardless of their political power. And that question has not yet been fully resolved in favor of consistency. The Memorial Garden at 1959 Southern Boulevard is small, easy to miss if you do not know to look for it. It is there because a community decided that the 87 people who died on that block deserved a permanent acknowledgement. Not because the city commissioned a major memorial, not because the political system decided that this community's loss required a civic monument, because the Garifuna community of the West Farms neighborhood in the Bronx built one themselves. On the same block where the city's failure to follow up on a closure order produced 87 deaths, the garden has benches, flowers, the names of those who died. If you go to the garden and sit there for a few minutes and look at the names, what you are looking at is not just a memorial to 87 specific people. You are looking at the cost of 800 buildings that were not closed, of follow-up inspections that were not conducted, of enforcement resources that were not sustained, of a political system that mobilized briefly and impressively and then moved on. The memorial is small. The lesson it contains is enormous, and New York City is still in the process of deciding whether it has fully learned it. If this story stays with you after you finish listening, that feeling is the correct response. This channel exists to tell the stories that come after the stories everyone already heard. The story of Happyland is the 87 people and the $1 of gasoline and Julio Gonzalez. The story after that story is 800 buildings and a task force that shrank. Both are true. Both need to be remembered. Tell us in the comments which part of this story you had never heard before, and which New York story you want us to find next. The next video builds directly on what you have just heard. Stay close.